Assalamu alaikum everyone. In this video we are going to discuss a paper of the CIE A-Level Business 9609, necessary and important for the attempt of May-June 2023. So this is the specimen paper. This resource is widely available on the internet as well. And in this video we are going to talk about the question number 1 that asks us to evaluate RF strategy for growth between 2008 and 2019, and the marks that we have are 20 marks. So first of all, the breakup for the marks is going to be in this particular order. We will inshallah later on in this video discuss as to how these marks are going to be obtained and in what levels or in what stages will the marks be given. So later in the segment of this video, I'll be sharing the answer that has been provided, a resource that has been provided by Cambridge, and we will be discussing it in detail as well. So first of all, let's start off with a little bit of reading so that we can dissect the case. It's always a good approach to first read the question and then go towards reading the case so that you know what pieces of information you have to extract from that particular case study. So RF was set up in Australia. So this is basically the home country. In 2001, when John Ryan bought a farm equipment and inventory for 1.5 million, he financed the purchase with a bank loan. Alright, so this is pretty much the initial finance, which was fully repaid by 2008. Initially, RF produced sugarcane, pineapples, and mango. So you can clearly see that there seems to exist a product portfolio. Now, my advice would be whenever you're reading the case, try to identify that in which sector of activity the business falls. So here in this case, we can clearly see that this is a primary sector business and this is a farming business. And try to think of a few important factors that are going to affect the success of this business. For example, a lot is dependent on the weather, or how does this business protect itself from the danger of pest invasion, from the danger of fire or floods, and so on and so forth. All right, so let's move on. Now here in this question, there's a timeline given to you. And as you can clearly see, it ranges from 2008 to 2019, making sure that the candidates use these pieces of information in their answers. So what you have to do is, let me just give you a quick way as to how you can approach this particular question. What you have to do is, if you can see that each of the varying timelines are actually giving you further information in the appendices that are attached below. So what you have to do is, while you're reading that particular timeline, you have to think as to how the steps taken by the business proved to be successful with respect to the strategy and proved to be unsuccessful or harmful for the business. So remember, this particular question is a past tense question. Things have already happened. So even if you were to discuss the impacts that, for example, the business did this, which would have possibly resulted in this. So when you're mentioning which could have possibly resulted in this, you need to apply this with the information that is given to you in the case. So rather than imagining your own impacts, try to write specific impacts that you can find data for in that particular case study. So let's start off with the reading of the timeline. In 2008 till 2014, you can clearly see that several purchases of land has been done, and the objective behind the purchase of land is to increase capacity, gain economies of scale, and maximize profit margins. And once the business had enough sufficient profits, the business invested all the profits back into the business to expand further. So the strategy that we have is the strategy for growth. And as we know that growth can exist either internally or organically, or can be done by the help of another business by taking it over, or let's say merging with it, which is known as external growth. So in this case, up till now, you can clearly see that the business is doing internal growth. It's increasing its capacity, it's trying to double its output, and the primary reason and the primary objective that can be deduced may be to drive down cost or to increase profits. Because even if you were to increase capacity, you'll gain the benefit of economies of scale. So we can assume up till now that the objective that has been kept against the strategy that has been implemented can be categorized as the move to increase profits. Alright, let's move on. So all land converted to sugarcane production. So what evidence can you find to prove that increasing profits may be a possible objective for this business? As you can see, the case study further mentioned that all land was converted to sugarcane production. Primarily, the business had been producing 3 different crops: sugarcane, pineapples, and mangoes. But now the land was converted to sugarcane production, and you can possibly determine the reason as to why did the business do this. Because obviously, if you had this farming area and you had sugarcane here, you had pineapple here, you had mangoes here, and now you've converted the entire area to sugarcane, this means that you have increased its production, which would obviously mean that you would be ordering raw materials in bulk, fertilizers in bulk, HYV seeds in bulk, and then again you'll be benefiting from economies of scale. So another evidence as to how we can link this with increasing profits. Now before we move on to 2016, I would suggest that we go through the appendix 1 that has been given to us. Alright, so sugarcane production in Australia. Now remember that Australia is our home country. So large profit margins. And then it's written 80% of Australian sugarcane is exported. The main export markets include Russia, China, and Indonesia, and the United States. Australia does not subsidize sugarcane production. However, European and American producers are subsidized. Now, while reading this case, you don't have to think about the benefits of entering the markets for Europe or America or China or Indonesia. No, that's not what you have to do, because this question is past tense. What you have to do is the decisions that the business took, that we just went through, the decisions that the business took, how do you think they were good steps, they were the right things to do? And what evidence do you have from the case to support it? And why do you think that the steps that the business took from 2008 to 2015 were not right or unsuccessful? Like, if you go back, the business converted its entire land into sugarcane production and purchased several pieces of land to increase capacity and gain economies of scale. So why was reducing cost in the first place important? Because you were somehow competing with European and American producers. And those producers were getting a benefit of subsidies being received from the government, which would obviously reduce their per unit costs. So since you were not being subsidized by the government, it was necessary for you to drive down your cost on your own so that you can achieve international competitiveness. And considering the fact that you do not get any benefit from the government offered, it would have been a more sustainable way to become self-sufficient. So yes, this particular data can be linked with the first part of decisions being successful. Then moving on, Brazilian sugarcane farmers are more efficient than Australian sugarcane farmers, which means that Brazilian sugarcane farmers are able to drive down their cost even further. And then global demand for sugarcane and sugarcane products is forecast to continue growing. There is pressure on the industry to make production more sustainable, example, using less water. Now, for the last point, there has seemed to be less evidence given in the case study regarding the extent to which Ryan used sustainable methods of farming. So there is pretty much an absence of data, which makes it difficult to evaluate completely as to how 2008 till 2015 strategy was successful. But then again, up till now, you would have to link different pieces of the appendix to the timeline and clearly state whether they were successful or whether they were unsuccessful. Then moving on, if you see in 2016, Ryan basically did an opposite strategy, that is, Ryan took the help of external means, and that is taking over another business, a neighboring farm, for $10 million. Now, this again basically proves that Ryan has an underlying objective to increase economies of scale. But then again, if a business increases in size, there are chances that the business will be able to experience and enjoy lower cost per unit. But there are equal chances of running into a zone of diseconomies of scale as well. And that may be evident with the information that we have, that we are just going to read. So this was financed by a bank loan and a sale of shares in RF Limited, a newly created private limited company. So you can see that the bank loan that had initially been taken had been repaid, but now the business was trying to create a mixture of both debt and equity. Now we'll have to see how much debt the business has, because that is going to determine the ultimate returns that shareholders are going to get by investing in that private limited company. So now, since you have more stakeholders involved, when you think about the positive and negative of this particular strategy, you just do not need to talk about Ryan himself. Now you can link your particular strategy with how, let's say for example, it will increase shareholder wealth, it will increase the dividends that shareholders will receive, or if, let's say for example, if it will have any effect on the share price. But since it's a private limited company, so share price may not be affected until and unless had it been trading on the stock exchange. So John is the controlling authority, holds 51% of the shares, and is the managing director. So as far as we can see up till now, this particular move basically granted the business, this may be a good strategy, because this granted the business the benefit of limited liability that was not available to the business before, making it more secure and increasing its financial capacity to raise more loans. So financial economies of scale can also be seen to be enjoyed by this particular business. But before we move towards further judgments, it would be advisable to go through the appendix. So Appendix 2, HR Director's Report Summary following the RF takeover of BKL 2016. The two firms had very different corporate cultures. RF uses hard HRM, whereas BKL uses soft HRM. Most of the BKL employees were on flexi-time contracts. RF employees have annualized contracts. So you can clearly see that there has been a difference in culture. And since this business was overly focused on ensuring more and more profits, it somehow ignored or did not plan for the diseconomies that may arise, which may include poor coordination, poor communication, or low labor motivation. And let's dive into this further. RF moved BKL employees onto analyzed contracts, so there has been a shift from flexi time to analyzed. But half of them chose to leave. Recruitment is difficult. Productivity is forecast to fall. So then again, recruitment is difficult, which means that it's going to cost you. And since people are leaving, it would have increased your labor turnover, which would have directly impacted your productivity as well. So though the business was pretty much determined to increase profits, the business did not plan for possible resistance to change. So this can stand out as a negative point as well, and we are going to develop it. That as to how or as to what kind of drawbacks this particular move or not planning for the differences in culture could have resulted for RF. So we may use the data that is given to us in the end, but in a little while. Alright, so let's move on. RF purchases a new building financed by a mortgage. So we already had bank loans, and now we are increasing our debt, which is likely to have an impact on the overall gearing of the business. RF shareholders approve company's financial results at the AGM. See Appendix 4. Now, I would suggest when you're forming paragraphs of this particular question, it would be advisable to discuss these both in one paragraph with the possible drawbacks and limitations as to how this move was successful and as to how this move proved to be unsuccessful, and then separately discuss the external growth strategy, and then in the third paragraph of the main body discuss the strategy taken for external financing by taking loans, and then discussing its impact on the shareholders' value creation. So this paragraph is not advised for you to read right now because this is relatable to question number 2. So we'll move towards appendix 3 and appendix 4. Increases RF's capacity. The new building that was purchased increases RF's inventory capacity by 300%. Allows RF to hold high levels of inventory for several months to take advantage of price changes. So you can produce sugarcane at a lower cost and then keep them and then sell them at a higher rate. But considering it's a primary sector business and considering the very nature of the sugarcane crop, it loses its sugar content the moment it is harvested. It starts to lose sugar content. So it's basically a type of commodity, a type of product, a type of crop, agricultural produce that cannot be apparently saved or piled up as inventory until and unless it is being manufactured into finished products such as sugar. So computerized inventory control system to manage the excess inventory that you're going to keep. And then the business does suggest an implementation of ERP used by all major sugar factories. So we can see that this business has moved towards secondary sector as well. So much would depend upon the benefit of this point, much would depend upon how timely the business had converted the sugarcane into sugar. Because the case does suggest that employee productivity is forecasted to fall. And if employee productivity has fallen or had fallen, the business would not have been able to convert the maximum amount of sugarcane into sugar by the right time, which would have restricted the benefit that you could have gained from this particular decision. Alright, so we have appendix 4, analysis of RS financial accounts between 2015 and 2018. So just very quickly, we are going to refer back to the case, and we can see that in 2016, this became a company. So this is the year in which it became a company. So the years that follow are going to be especially important for the shareholders. And while we are discussing this, we can draw conclusions about the impact of the business decisions on the shareholders. Alright, so this is supposed to be a paragraph on liquidity, data on liquidity, and then if you consider these two, they are being linked with the overall profitability of the business. This is financial efficiency, and this is gearing itself a category. Alright, so let's discuss. So up till to 2016, the internal growth did prove to be fruitful because it was being managed. It did not reach that much of a larger scale. It was being managed. Up till 2016, things do seem okayish because of the fact that your profit for the year had been increasing as well, which obviously indicates that the internal growth strategy was fruitful, and your ROCE although has fallen, but then again, it can be assumed that the ROCE possibly would have, because the profits are increasing. If you talk about the formula of ROCE, it's operating profit upon capital employed multiplied by 100. So the operating profits are increasing, which obviously suggests that the fall in ROCE might not be due to a fall in profits, because that's clearly not happening. The fall in ROCE might be due to the increase in capital employed, because the business can be seen to invest more and more. And when the denominator increases, the ROCE might fall. And that is exactly what is happening in the case. So you can talk about this, that the ROCE in 2016, when you're making that particular paragraph, so you can talk about how the return on capital employed has fallen, but it does not necessarily mean that it would have been harmful, because the profit for the year had been increasing, which indicates that the reason behind fall in the ROCE might be due to an increase in the amount of investment made by the business. which indicates that this may not be that bad for the company, because this suggests that when you invest in more and more assets, you tend to increase your future profitability, because better machines or better capacity would result in a greater potential to earn profits. But if you proceed beyond 2016, when the external growth did not prove to be as much beneficial as you expected it to be, because there had been differences in corporate culture, and since it was a labor intensive business, it was pretty much dependent on labor, and half of the labor started to leave. So obviously you can see its implications on the falling profitability and on the following ROCE as well. So perhaps in the later years, ROCE did not fall because of the expansion of the business or investment in non-current assets, but rather due to a drastic fall in the profitability over the period of years. And another reason you can directly associate with the falling profitability, with the huge fall in profitability in comparison of these 2 years, can be the ridiculous amount of debt that has increased, which means that majority of the profits would have been given out in the payment of interest. So shareholders who had invested in 2016 would have expected some kind of dividends, or would have invested some kind of return on their investments. But since the business had been reinvesting all of its profits, you can clearly see that it may not have been that much successful from an investment perspective, because majority of your profits have already been spent in the payment of interest, and you're left with a very few amount of profits, and therefore the company's potential to pay higher dividends has been compromised, as clearly seen in the data. So this is pretty much your financial analysis. Then again, the examiner did quote on several different mediums that the candidates do not need to use each and every piece of information given to them in the different appendices that we attach. The better approach would be to use specific pieces of information that the candidates can develop a chain of analysis on. So if you want, you can discuss about liquidity if you're more comfortable in it, or you can talk about the rate of inventory turnover, which seems to be falling over the period of years, and considering it's a farming business, it would be better if inventory turnover is relatively more high. So this is pretty much the analysis. So if you talk about how would you structure this particular answer, a starting paragraph in which you're going to identify the strategy that had been chosen and the possible underlying objective that the business aimed to achieve via the implementation of the strategy that you've just mentioned. And in the same paragraph, if you want, you can talk about how this business is a primary sector business, indicating the need to drive down costs, considering that there had been no external economies of scale, such as subsidies from the government to reduce the cost of production for these businesses or for all the farming businesses in Australia. Now, what I would suggest is you make 3 paragraphs of the main body in which you discuss different segments of the timeline that is given to you. So let's say, for example, 2008 till 2015 may be covered here, 16 may be a separate year that may be covered here, and 17 and 18, or let's say, for example, 17, 18, 19, or 16 and 17 may be covered here, or 18 and 19 may be covered here. It's completely up to you. So you discuss all the timeline with respect to different segregation via the paragraphs in your answer, and then you're going to have a conclusion paragraph. Now, in the conclusion paragraph, it would be important for you to analyze the entire strategy as a whole. And when I say analyzing the entire strategy as a whole, I do not mean that summarizing whatever you have written above. No. What you need to do is you need to analyze the entire strategy with respect to how did the strategy provided a particular fit for the business and how it proved to be unsuccessful overall. For example, does the strategy indicate the impact on key stakeholders? Because if you go through the case and just read like 1 or 2 lines, in 2020, a fire destroyed all RF's buildings and its inventory of recently harvested sugarcane. So you talk about the entire strategy, that the strategy overall had been absent with a particular contingency plan in case of a natural disaster. Or is the strategy considering the impact on key stakeholders? Was the strategy adaptive? Had you planned for a temporary increase because your productivity was forecasted to fall? So were there measures to take in order to increase productivity? Were there any hints? There were hints of annualized contracts, but then again, perhaps 0 hour contracts would have been better, because to respond to an increase in demand, a sudden increase in demand that may be possible, that may be very common in primary sector businesses such as farming. So you talk about the entire strategy overall as to how it proved beneficial and as to how it proved unsuccessful in the conclusion paragraph. Also, had you been in the place of Ryan, could there be any alternative strategy that you could have taken to achieve the same objective? And how do you think that particular alternative strategy would have increased profits for Ryan? So this is what you have to write in the conclusion. And if you do not analyze the overall strategy, the maximum marks you are going to get in analysis are going to be 6 out of 8. So this particular exercise will not be enough if I do not show you the endorsed examiner answer from the Cambridge. So let's go towards reading the answer. As you can see, I have used a color coding to highlight different assessment objectives, namely knowledge, application, analysis, and evaluation. And while reading this, I may skim read this, but while reading this, I'm going to make different comments regarding the highlighting that I've done. So as you can see in the first paragraph, from here to here, the candidate does mention a few pieces of information and tries to link them. But then again, this application is divided into 2 levels, level 1 and level 2. Level 1 is that you tend to use things from the case, but you do not form substantiated links. You do not form multiple links. So just writing the fact that you reinvested your profits to increase capacity may be a weak link. If the capacity was increased, was there any other benefit that you can find from the case that had been given to you and try to link with that? So that might happen in the later part of the answer, but in the first paragraph, this is just basic restatement of the facts that have been given to you in the case study. Alright, so moving on, the candidate does mention that the benefits of internal growth are that RF can produce more products at a lower average unit cost, that is economies of scale. So there's 1 mark for knowledge here, because the answer does state the concept of economies of scale and a lower average unit cost. Because then again, if you go back towards the case study only mentioned it had to gain economies of scale, but the candidate wrote its meaning that it wanted to reduce its average unit cost or its per unit cost. Now this is only possible if the candidate has knowledge of the concept of economies of scale. So it does not mean that if you were to score or secure 3 on 3 on knowledge, you need to have a definition in the first paragraph. No. Even if you were to mention the key concepts or the key terms or the definition of those terms regarding whatever you're writing in the answer, as long as they're relevant, you will get marks for knowledge. Alright, so the candidate does mention the per unit cost that have reduced and then builds on this is likely to. Now such words, when you mention this will result in, or this is likely to, or this will be a benefit because, you're moving into explanation, you're moving into impacts, which obviously indicates that now a higher level order of skills may be tested, and that is analysis. So this is likely to have increased the profitability of RF and in the long run the profit of the business. Up until 2016, this also increased John's wealth because he was the sole owner, and beyond 2016, it would have increased the value of the shares and dividends of the business. Now, on these lines, you can clearly see that the analysis does not stop at this point. The analysis is developed further into a chain, and different pieces of information from the case are linked as well. So yes, there is application, and not just application, but there is a chain of analysis going on. Excuse me. So there's a chain of analysis going on, because when you talk about profitability increasing, you talk about the impact it would have on John's wealth. And since the company became a private limited company after 2016, it talked about the impact that profitability had on the shareholders as well. The same thing that we mentioned. So pretty much benefits have been covered here. As far as the drawbacks are concerned, however, because the profits were being reinvested, John and the shareholders may not have benefited. This might have been specially bad. Now, as you can see, I have made a color combination, a color coding green that stands for evaluation, and I've basically marked this specially bad as evaluative comment. Why is this evaluation, or can we count it as an evaluative comment? Because when you try to show the priority of something, of a certain point over others, or when you try to indicate by your writing that, okay, fine, all the benefits at one side, but this benefit at the side would have the highest impact, or would be especially good, or would be especially useful. So this is when you are basically using different pieces of information and trying to prioritize one set of information over the others. So therefore, this may be regarded as an evaluative comment. So this might have been especially bad for the shareholders, as many of them have only purchased RF shares for dividend and share price. This can be particularly seen in the reduction in profit. Now the candidate moves further to develop his argument and has gained a chain of analysis at the end of the response as well, clearly seen here. Alright, now in the next paragraph, the candidate discusses about external growth. So let's read a bit about external growth as well. So RF also successfully used external growth by taking over the neighboring farm in 2016. The benefits of external growth are that it is a quick way to grow the business. Now then again, benefits had not been mentioned in the case. Only such students can write benefits who have knowledge of the concept, and therefore I have marked this as yellow because this is likely to gain a knowledge mark. Then the candidate moves on to mention that RF gains all the production facilities of the neighboring farm as well as its customer base. Now I cannot identify, as a checker, I cannot identify whether this point can stand out as a benefit, because it has just mentioned that RF gains all production facilities of the neighboring farm as well as customer base. So this brings me to the question, why is this a benefit in the first place? If, let's say, or how will it become a benefit? And then the candidate could have evaluated this line of argument as well. But the candidate chose not to and directly moved to the other side, and those are the drawbacks. So there seems to be an absence in the chain of analysis that could have been brought in the particular response. However, there are significant differences into how the two farms' human resources are managed. Now the candidate moves on to talk about the differences in corporate culture that we discussed in pretty much detail while we were dissecting and reading the case. So you will get marks for knowledge. As you can clearly see here, you will get marks for knowledge. And since different pieces of information are linked together, you will get marks for application as well. Now then again, this impacted on productivity, this led to, this resulted in, then again you're moving into analysis. And if you remember what I just told a little while ago, that if you mention that this point may extremely be important or very bad for shareholders or very good for shareholders or very good for the business, amongst all the benefits, this point has the most impact. So this is the same thing that the candidate has done at the end, that this is likely to have a significant effect. Without enough employees, not only productivity will have fallen, and XYZ and XYZ and XYZ. And the candidate moves on to develop a chain of arguments. That is exactly what students need to do. So then there is a paragraph that considers the external growth, the last segment. But then again, you may choose to read it, but as far as I am seeing, the candidate had this approach in which he discussed two of the segments of the timeline in much greater detail and just somehow summarized what was there in the later segments of the timeline, such as 2018, 2019, and did not throw much light on it. As you can see that the paragraph's length is also compromised, but it may be realistic considering that the time that we have is very less in paper 4. Alright, so the last conclusion. Overall, RF strategy led to significant growth. For example, the building increased RF's inventory capacity by 300%. Likewise, the purchase of BKL, despite having HRM issues, had a significant amount of land. Now, if you see that this paragraph is basically a summary of whatever is written above. And I don't think that this paragraph will constitute for any marks, because only the things from the case have been restated and requoted, and whatever was mentioned above in the answer has been requoted and summarized. The candidate does move on to talk about the external growth strategy, but then again, the practice was the same. In the last paragraph, the candidate does try to, make a comment on the overall strategy, but it's not that successful, because even then, the alternate approaches that the business could use or the impact on key stakeholders that seem to be missing from the case. These things are the things that you need to talk about when you're talking about analyzing a strategy on the whole. So if you go through these examiner comments, you'll know that the comments that we just discussed are how the examiner expects the answer to be written. Like, for example, if you talk about knowledge, it clearly shows that, the answer does show a benefit of it being quicker as compared to internal growth. It's talking about external growth, the thing that we marked knowledge above in the answer. And the same thing that has been done with respect to the second paragraph as well. So if you were to read these examiner comments, you'll understand that the marking that we have done is pretty much in line with what the examiner is going to expect from the candidate sitting for the paper 4 exam in the May-June 2023 attempt. So if you read this particular paragraph, you'll know that the answer does not move into level 3 analysis because the overall strategy is not analyzed. The same thing that we were discussing. And it requires the entire strategy to be analyzed, not just the individual elements. So the answer was good. Another misconception I would like to debunk is that evaluation is not something that you do at the end. Even the answer, it tried to evaluate each of its argument alongside the paragraph and not just wait for all the evaluative comments to be piled up and written in the last paragraph. So good evaluation does not just happen at the end of the answer. The entire answer should be directed towards evaluation, and it can be rewarded at any place in the answer. This is the same thing I tell the students in my classes as well, that they need to be thorough when it comes to writing their paragraphs and need to make sure that before starting any other argument, they need to first think that if there's a benefit, can there be something that can happen that would reduce the usefulness of that particular point? Or does the impact depend on something? Or do you need any extra information to estimate the complete impact, and that extra piece of information is not given in the case? So before jumping on to another argument, try to first put it down and think, can I evaluate it? How can I evaluate it? How can I evaluate it differently? So that even if you are, let's say for example, losing time in your papers, you would at least not lose a chunk of marks for evaluation, because you've saved yourself from risking it all. All right. So you can go through these particular mistakes if you want. So I hope this provides a good foundation for you when you're attending the paper 4 exam. First, try to make sure that you try to solve this question on your own. Try to write an answer. Try to come up with the points. And then, just make sure that you follow examiner guidelines and whatever has been shared in this video. Once you acquire enough confidence, you can attempt further questions and improve your understanding of this particular examination paper. So that's it from my side. Take care, everyone. Thank you and all the best for your exams.